Okay, I think we're set.
Are we ready? Madeline, are we good? All right. That was an emphatic yes. So I don't know if I'm in the right spot or not. There's no little X to land on here. My name is Bill Dara. I'm with the Chicago Maritime Museum, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming here in our wonderful, this is the world premiere museum that's based on the Chicago waterways. It's probably the only museum based on the Chicago waterways, but there you go. We've got some more program coming up. This Thursday is our big gala fundraiser, all hands on deck. Kind of sounds a little intense. Thursday, October 26th at 6 o'clock. So that's our big annual fundraiser. So either get tickets and come on down or go online. November 11th, we'll have another Third Friday talk. That'll be by Walter Lewis. It's the history of shipbuilding in Chicago. And then December 15th, we've got another one on the schedule. I'm not sure who that is. But tonight, we've got Dr. Larry McClellan. We just established the 5th cousin of General McClellan of the Union Army. So, but I think he's a little more proud of being a professor emeritus at Governor State University and a founder of that university. So he's going to speak about freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad in Chicago and Northern Illinois. So, Dr.
Thank you. Well, as you all saw, it's always a little crazy at the beginning of the and once it's set, then it is really, really hard. I'm delighted to be with you this evening and to share some thoughts about the Underground Railroad, and then also there may be some of you that want to get doing some things. We're always looking for volunteers. We started Governor State University in 1970, and I had been involved in racial justice concerns of one sort or another since my college days. And as we were starting Governor State, I immediately got involved with community leadership in the historic Black communities that are south of Chicago. So I was getting to know people in Robbins and Fort Heights and Phoenix and the historic Black neighborhoods, Chicago Heights, was finding that research of those connections really interesting. But every once in a while, there was some reference to the Underground Railroad. And my experience was, growing up, all right, the Underground Railroad, that was on the East Coast, Harry Tubman, Frederick Douglass, that happened out there. Why are there references to the Underground Railroad here? And so that began a kind of set of questions to me. And about 20 years ago, I got very serious about those questions, and now have discovered that, in fact, we've got a very, very rich history here in Illinois, and it's been related to a rich history with the Underground Railroad in Northwest Indiana. And so I've kind of been up to my ears with this stuff forever and ever. And I've got delighted that my colleague Tom Shepard is here so that we can have some things that he can share. I will wander around a bit, but I think I need to be closer here to the mic. Gotcha. Okay. As we talk about the Underground Railroad, there are really two great cycles of stories. There are the stories of people who were enslaved and found the means as individuals, as families, as small groups to escape from their enslavement, and they went in all kinds of directions. There's that great set of stories about what we now call freedom seekers. And there's a second great set of stories about the people that responded, that said, oh, somehow or another, we've got to help these folks. They're on their way to freedom. And the dilemma is that for the last 160 years, people have written a lot and talked a lot and researched a lot about the second set of stories, and not the other. And what we really need to do is to reframe this whole conversation so that we are talking both about the stories of freedom seekers and the stories of the networks of the Underground Railroad. The dilemma we have is that for 150 years, mostly old white guys were writing about the romantic activities of old white guys. And so all the Underground Railroad stories are about all these old white guys. And that's a really, really distorted picture. And I can get away with saying that because I'm an old white guy. And I understand how you can get caught up in this sort of thing. So I think the fundamental issue is, how do we reframe the stories? And of course, at the get-go, this is a cartoon from the Western Citizen, which was a rabid abolitionist newspaper in the 1840s. And of course, it has, by then, in the 1840s, the people who were responding to freedom seekers were already calling themselves the Underground Railroad. And here is this classic picture of, the train going underground. Of course, the Underground Railroad was not underground, and it was not a railroad. All right, so just, be clear. I think really clearly what was going on was that in the 1830s and 40s, the railroads were the great new technology of America. And I think that it's the language of the railroads kind of fit with what was happening with the movement of freedom seekers and the work of the Underground Railroad. And so that language stuck. But we now have to contend with people talk about routes and conductors and station masters and all that. So it was not an underground thing. It was not a railroad thing, but that is the name that we all carry forward. Now, to look at how we do that balance is to recognize, first of all, that freedom seeker stories are essentially journey stories. And I've got up here 6 or 7 lines representing journeys by folks coming out of their enslavement. I could add another 50 or 60 lines, because we now know very clearly the journeys that many people took. And we know names, families, where they came from, where they were enslaved, and all that. But essentially, freedom seeker stories are journey stories, and the language of the Underground Railroad has been language of sights. What happens here? So we have very different kinds of language, a language of journey, and we've got a language of sight. And we have to kind of bring that language all together. So what we're up to, and there are other people around the country doing this also, is how do we reframe this whole conversation? And there are several very important components in that reframing. First of all, the people that were involved, the people that were escaping their enslavement, in the 19th century language and by 19th century law, they were considered fugitive slaves. All right? The great destructive piece of federal legislation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, really was disastrous for many, many people. But that was the language of the day. And to talk about fugitive slaves was to talk about a category of property. It is very difficult for us to understand some human beings owning other human beings. But in that 19th century context, we're talking about fugitive slaves as missing property. That's a property category. What we are choosing to do over the last 30 years is to rather look at the humanity of the situation and see that these folks that were coming up out of their enslavement, they were seizing their freedom. And freedom seizers is real hard to say. But we're all happy talking about freedom seekers. That essentially looking at people enslaved in the South and understanding them in terms of their human intention instead of their property label. So, of course, we're talking about the fugitive slaves, and from time to time I'll reference that, but we use the freedom seeker to be getting at the fundamental humanity of people enslaved who were desiring their freedom. Now, along with that is to understand that the traditional stories of the Underground Railroad have tended to be stories of benevolent whites who have created a framework called the Underground Railroad, and these poor, hapless slaves that kind of stumble around and they need to be helped. And that is a kind of mythology. The protagonists in all this are the people who, by any means necessary, were grabbing their freedom. They were seeking their freedom in all kinds of ways, They are the protagonists in this grand story. And the other folks, the white abolitionists and the black abolitionists who responded to them, began, as they were responding, they began to develop networks of connection, and that's how the Underground Railroad goes. So the historical misinterpretation is the Underground Railroad was created to help slaves. No. People seeking their freedom came up, and they were the ones that created the responses. They needed directions, they needed some food, they needed help, whatever. And it was the activity of the freedom seekers that creates the networks that eventually become the Underground Railroad. Now, another element in the reframing is to understand the diversity of those involved. Because most of the history we have, until very recently, been written by old white guys about old white guys. They all wrote about white guys. But when you just think of the face of it, if you were going to have people staying overnight in your house, strangers, or strangers arrive and say, well, you can put up in the barn. That's a family decision. That's men and women figuring out together, what do we do? Are our children going to be okay? Are we going to work this out? Do we let people stay in the barn, et cetera, et cetera? So it was not a male decision, but these were family decisions. And in fact, a lot of the families that were involved in the work of the Underground Railroad were families of African descent. And so there are both white abolitionists and black abolitionists up to their ears with us. And we have some very powerful cycles of stories about women providing very directive leadership in the activities of the Underground Railroad, right here in Illinois. And those are stories to be looking at that diversity and telling those stories is really important. And then finally, as I already alluded to, we need to reframe this because this is a story that is much, much larger than Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And God bless Harriet Tubman. One of my pet peeves is that every February in Black history, all kinds of Illinois school kids learn a lot about Harriet Tubman. Well, God bless Harriet Tubman. But there was all this going on in Illinois, and we have some great heroes and great people to talk about, and that has not been part of our education in this state. So hopefully, what I'm doing along with some other people is going to help to change that. So now, as we begin to look at this, we always have to remember what starts all this is the brutal reality of slavery. Kidnapping in Africa, the horrendous journeys across the Atlantic Ocean, and this real strange phenomenon of people selling other people. And when I do my research in the 1840s and 50s, I don't look at property records. I'm looking at estate sales and tax records because it's with the cows and the pigs and the horses and the sheep, they list the slaves, right? I mean, we can't wrap our minds around this, but we need to try. And because of the overwhelming brutality of this, it is no accident that the seriousness of people finding their freedom was really, really powerful. This is a cartoon from the Chicago Defender, 1941, talking about it. And the Chicago Defender, the very famous black newspaper in Chicago, and it reflects that kind of sensibility. By any means necessary to find our freedom because people will not own us. That's a really, really powerful thing to remember. We're talking about people running for their lives, dealing with very, very serious consequences if they were caught and returned. Okay, now what happened? Where did people go? Coming out of the enslaved states, they went in all kinds of directions. Into Mexico, into the far west to live with native peoples, into the Caribbean. Some people commandeered ships and sailed them to New England. A great number went into the northern states. And my little blue lines on this map, support some of that. Also, what's interesting about this map is to notice the distinction between the red states and the black, basically the black states, the dark states. That the red states are the free states, and of course, California, In 1850, had just been admitted into the Union. But the free states, the map helps us to understand how complicated this is. Because Missouri, slave state, Kentucky, slave state, Maryland, slave state, Delaware, slave state, they never left the Union. All right? We forget that the Civil War was fought. On one side were slave supporting states, on the other side were both free and slave supporting states. Okay? It gets complicated. Yes.
I'm just gonna make a quick adjustment here.
Oh, okay.
People
Oh,
won't
there
see.
seeing me. Okay, good, good, good. Hi, all. When Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves, we forget he freed the slaves in the Confederacy. He did not free the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. So that's kind of tricky. Another thing about the map, you'll notice that Illinois drops kind of like a dagger into the states. And there are a couple hundred miles along the Mississippi River and the Ohio River where people enslaved could walk to the river, and that's freedom, just over the river. So it's no accident that large numbers of people enslaved came into Illinois from Missouri and from Kentucky. And one other detail about the map that is interesting to note is that Cairo, which is in southern Illinois, and southern Illinois before the war was really southern. Actually, there was one county in southern Illinois decided to secede from the Union. And within a week or so, the federal troops arrived, and they realized actually they were in the middle of Illinois, and the troops were there. Maybe they should not secede, so they changed their mind, decided they would not secede from the Union. But Cairo and those southern counties are further south than most of the state of Virginia. Okay? So there is this southern phenomenon that is part of the complication of the Illinois story. Okay, now, particularly because we're at the Maritime Museum, I wanted to add in this bit of our conversation because you all who are water-oriented will understand this far more deeply than a lot of people do. So I wanted to make sure I got this. Why are we here in Chicago? Why are there 17 million people, 7 million people around the bottom of Lake Michigan? Because this is this great place of transition between water systems. And this is something you all understand. A lot of people don't get it, but you do. That in fact, from where we're standing, everything that is east and north of us goes to the Atlantic Ocean. Everything that is west and south of us goes to the Gulf of Mexico. Because we're sitting right on a great continental divide. And all of these water systems go to the Atlantic, and so that means this was the great point of transition for people traveling by water. And of course, human beings for thousands of years either walked or they traveled by water. And this becomes a point of real significance for the development of Chicago and why Chicago then is really important in our freedom seeker stories. There have been well-established human communities here for 10, 12,000 years. And in some of the archaeological work that's been done, particularly along the Calumet, we've got archaeological materials that come out of the Great Lakes, and we've got archaeological materials that come out of the communities that were along the Mississippi River. So this was this place of great transition. And starting like about 300 or 400 years ago, this becomes a well-established home for the Council of Three Fires, basically led by the Potawatomi. And we have well-established communities here of people living here full-time, starting in the mid-18th century. And the native peoples understood, again, the importance of this place with the development of the Vincennes Trace, hundreds of years old, for people coming out of the Ohio River Valley, coming up to this great place of transition. And then in addition, the Great Salt Trail coming from the cities along the Mississippi, the indigenous cities, and connecting with people over on the Detroit side. And then an additional great trail was up there. And so the fact of this being a central location, there being great swamp areas here, meant that as people were coming up, they were funneled right here, and Native peoples understood that for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, now, there are probably, my research suggested 6,000 to 10,000 freedom seekers came out of southern states. Coming into Northeastern Illinois, at least 3,000 people found their way into Northeastern Illinois. And they, again, most came out of Missouri and Tennessee, but they came from all of the other states. One of the things that's been really interesting to discover recently is really beginning to understand that here in the Midwest, there was another whole pattern of movement that came up through Indiana and Ohio that went straight up, also heading for Detroit, but that is very different from the pattern that came up through Illinois.
Terribly sorry.
That's okay.
Quickly press a button and then I'm gone again.
Okay, that's cool. Buttons are good.
Doing a wonderful job so far.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
There we go.
She is dealing with the Zoom people or the WebEx, and she's doing her job there. Okay, so that there, as I was saying, there was been really intrigued by discovering how this relates and does not relate, how it parallels and does not parallel the kind of activity that came up through Indiana. So there are these great cycles of stories of people coming out of the deep South, escaping from their enslavement in Missouri, in Mississippi, and Alabama, Louisiana. A large number of people, and the stories we have of freedom seekers coming out of Missouri and coming into various parts of Illinois, and then other kind of patterns, overland patterns, and patterns along rivers, and the folks who were coming, again, were mainly from Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then just about every other place. So just real interesting patterns of movement. Now, one of the things that I started thinking about and saying is that we really need to understand we have the dilemma of the Underground Railroad language, and people want to think about roots. And we've got to say that's very tricky, because in fact, people came in very, very diverse kind of areas. And looking particularly at the very southern entry points in the state and at the area around St. Louis, in fact, we've got all kinds of people that are traveling upriver, literally on the river itself, on riverboats. There are people that are traveling alongside the rivers. There are people that are going overland and crossing via land and crossing the rivers. We've got people who are traveling independently. We've got some people that look for tiny bits of assistance. We have people traveling as individuals, families, and groups. And so I think it might be valuable for us to think about streams of movement by freedom seekers and not get caught on, oh, they were all on this particular trail. That when we talk about trails, that's a way of talking about how we commemorate and talk about this stuff, but understand people were in very, very diverse conditions and were moving toward their freedom in any way necessary. And if any of us were traveling north in the dark, we would probably not always be on the road. Now, my focus has been on Illinois and Northwest Indiana, looking at two great streams of movement. The movement out of the Mississippi River Valley, Illinois River Valley, going to Chicago and through Chicago, and also the movement of people coming up and going straight east. And there are a whole host of reasons why people might choose to go to Chicago or might choose to avoid Chicago. Family business connections, the location of slave catchers, the weather, there are any number of ways, but what we know is that there were two very powerful patterns of movement. People going to and through Chicago, and then people bypassing Chicago. And this tended to focus, and again, I don't want to get rigid about roads, but those streams of movement focused on two historic great historic roads. First of all was the Salt Trail, which of course had been a native trail forever and ever, and became used by all of the early settlers. And also there was the development of a road from Chicago to Detroit, and that road developed in 1825 by the federal government. That road followed the Salt Trail into Indiana and then went up to go around the loop. So we have these great patterns of movement and hundreds of people in these patterns of movement. Some of them were in a corridor that included this movement. Others were in a corridor that bypassed Chicago along the Salt Trail. Now, getting into Chicago, people came in all kinds of ways. A number of people, the green represents the I&M Canal, and the others are historic roads that people took as they were getting to Chicago. Chicago was a sanctuary city. Across the Mississippi River Valley, people knew about Chicago as a place of refuge. After 1850 and the horrendous Fugitive Slave Act, it became a way station, because the only way to be free was to get out of the land of the free and get yourself into Canada. So the Chicago was both a place to go and also a place to go through. And over time, Chicago as this very small town. Think of the Loop. That was the size of Chicago, okay, in the 40s and 50s. And there was tremendous activity all over Northeastern Illinois. And I've identified about 60 places where we know that freedom seekers found some kind of assistance. And you can see some of them along this Salt Trail route, others along these various roads going into the little town of Chicago. And only a few of these have been researched and recognized. So if something in you says, I want to do underground railroad research, let me know. We'd love to have you help. So there are about 60 sites, about 20 in the current city of Chicago. There are only 3 in Chicago that are recognized. 2. And across Northeastern Illinois, about another 19 places where I'm very confident we're going to be able to tell full stories about freedom seekers. Now, when people got to Chicago, there were abolitionists responding to freedom seekers all over Northeastern Illinois. But over time, some very unique dynamics developed in the city of Chicago. And there's not a clock. What time is it?
7:30.
7:31. Okay, I'm just where I want to be. All right. As freedom seekers were making their way to Chicago, fairly early on, people were responding and were providing help. Now, the traditional Chicago story, which is repeated in all kinds of Chicago history, is the Underground Railroad starts in Chicago in 1839, where Zabina Eastman and some other white abolitionists help a poor bedraggled slave who stumbles into LaSalle County, and they get him to Chicago and they get him safely onto Canada. Now that is that old white guy story. The reality is that from the beginning of Chicago, there were black families here. And from the beginning, those black families were assisting freedom seekers on their way through. By the late 1830s, Chicago was well known throughout the Mississippi River Valley as a place of refuge because people were having experience connecting with these black families. And then, of course, in 1838, the famous Louis Isbell arrives. And of course, you all know Louis. Huh?
Not really.
Probably one of the most remarkable Chicagoans that's ever lived. This guy was up to his ears in everything, and nobody knows. Nobody knows about Louis Isbell. I have a standing offer. If somebody wants to write a book about Louis Isbell, I'll help you. The remarkable guy, a man enslaved in Kentucky. He was given the farmer and his family and all the slaves moved to Illinois, was given his freedom in Southern Illinois. Probably Louis Isbell was the son of his master, but we don't know that yet for sure. However, he then ends up from central Illinois, getting up to Chicago in 1838, and opens up a barbershop, and immediately jumps in to providing assistance for freedom seekers that were arriving in Chicago. And over the 1840s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, Louis Isbell is a remarkable leader in the Black community and in the whole of Chicago. And you don't know his story. This is quite a guy. I've got some great stories, some slightly off color stories, but we've got great stories about Louis Isbell. So the Black community early on, they're helping freedom seekers coming in Chicago. In the late 1830s, a group of young white families moved to Chicago to make their fortunes. They come out of New York and New England, and they begin to experience these freedom seekers showing up, and they begin to say, we have to figure out how to respond to this. Now, you need to understand that in the 1840s, and then well into the 1850s, there was a large number of people in Chicago who were anti-slave. Okay, but slavery is a bad thing. Okay. How many of you have a cell phone? Right? Cell phones? Okay. It is very likely that part of your cell phone, some of the minerals and stuff in your cell phone, are the result of people working in Western China in nearly slave conditions. Now, do you care? Well, we kind of care, but that's a long way away. Think of slavery in the North like that. Slavery's bad, but that's a long way away. You know, it'd take us 3 weeks by carriage to get to Mississippi. You know, that's a long way away. Slavery's bad. So a lot of folks were anti-slavery. In the 40s and 50s, a small group of those people decide this has got to stop. Slavery is so evil, we have to abolish it, end it. Those are the abolitionists. And by the late 1850s, the abolitionist group becomes more and more powerful and help to shape the Republican Party. But then within the abolitionists, white abolitionists and Black abolitionists, women, are a tiny number who say, this is so terrible, we will break the law to help. That's the Underground Railroad. Freedom seekers running for their lives knew very well that everything they did was against the law. But what they ran into as responses developed in the North were people saying, we will break the law to help. And that's the Underground Railroad. Those are the networks that are responding to freedom seekers. The federal law said if you assist a freedom seeker and we catch you, we will fine you $1,000, $20,000 in our money, okay? To help a human being escape, we're going to fine you $20,000, throw you in jail on top. The situation was just awful. But there was a small number of folks, white abolitionists, Black abolitionists, white families and Black families, said, we will break the law. And this set of young white families in Chicago that settled there in the late 1830s, they eventually realized this is so serious, we will break the law to help folks. Then, by the middle of the 1840s, a remarkably similar group of young Black families settle in Chicago. Chicago begins to develop a reputation as a place of prosperity for free people of color. And Chicago develops this remarkable cadre of young families. And over time, when we get into the 1850s, these young white abolitionist families, who of course are getting older, and these Black abolitionist families begin to connect with each other and develop longtime friendships and really find the ways in the 1850s to break through the barriers of race. And there's some of us that argue that Chicago's first great civil rights movement was in the assistance provided to freedom seekers, and the assistance was provided by Black and white families working together. So there's this remarkable story, and almost everyone is saying, I could go on for 2 hours, but I will not do that. Leadership in the Black community was really in the hands of John and Mary Richardson Jones. Those are names that you may know. John Jones in the 70s was the first Black elected official in Cook County. There was a remarkable group of families at Quinn Chapel AME Church, including the Atkinsons and the Halls and others. Great Louis Isbell ends up in the late 1840s marrying Mary Jones's sister. And so he is in cahoots with the Joneses forever and ever. Crucial to all of that activity in the city, particularly after 1850, were these two remarkable churches. The Quinn AME African Methodist Episcopal Church was established as a prayer group in 1847, and by 1850 was a congregation. And the Zoar Baptist Church, which was kind of forming itself, becomes official in 1853. And John and Mary Jones are very central to Olivet Baptist, to Zoar Baptist. Zoar becomes Olivet Baptist, and the church on the right, that's Olivet Baptist. In the 1940s, Olivet Baptist Church was the largest Protestant church in the world, right here in Chicago.
Where are those churches?
Oh yeah, right. Well, Quinn Chapel was originally, you know, the Monadnock building downtown, Jackson and Dearborn, Monadnock building. That's where the Quinn Chapel was. But of course, during the Great Fire, it burned down, and they were a variety of other places, and then they built this structure on the left. They built in, I believe, 1891. It's at 24th and Wabash, and you know, relatively close. And then Olivet Baptist is at 31st and Dr. King Drive. So they're both in the heart. Actually, I've got a map I'll show you. So we had people that came into Chicago. We know there was all this activity going on in Chicago. And there's another little story that I've been deeply involved with for years with my colleague Tom Shepard, and that has to do with the great road that left Chicago. Remember this military road that the Feds developed in the 1820s? As it came around the bottom of Lake Michigan, it came up and went straight up into the city of Chicago. Now, that becomes the reverse for freedom seekers that were leaving the city. Some went by ships, by lake steamers around in Detroit. Others went overland, and they came down through, they went straight down 15 miles, and they ran into two areas of Dutch settlement. What we know today is Roseland, and what we know today is South Holland, were Dutch settlements established in the late 1840s. And as freedom seekers were coming down through farmland and open territory, they got to the Little Calumet River. They were coming very close, and they encountered Dutch folk, and from time to time they needed help. And particularly right there on the Little Calumet River was the location of a Dutch farm where folks were involved in assisting freedom seekers. So who was it? It was the farm of Jan and Angie Tan. And oops, I dropped my picture of Jan and Angie. I'm sorry. Well, imagine there was imagine Jan and Angie, Dutch-looking people. But anyways, this is their farm. It's on the north side of the Little Calumet River, and they established that in 1853. And there were two Dutch families, Cornelius and Martin Kuiper, and Jan and Angie Tan, who spoke English, and therefore they were the ones that ended up dealing with other people, the Anglos that were around, but also they were the ones that were dealing with freedom seekers. And we have done a lot of work on this, we do tours and so on, and right at the end of our presentation, I'd like to ask Tom tell a little bit about what some of the things we're up to. But we were able to get a historic marker established at the Tum Farm in September of 2022, and we had a really great time and a great celebration with Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton, Ronald Gaines, who owns the farm, owns the marina where this is located. This is Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Cook County Commissioner Donna Miller. There's Tom, And in the back is the Consul General for the Netherlands in Chicago. And they are the Dutch folk are very excited that there were Dutch families involved with this whole process. So we have been able to identify folks in and around Chicago that related to this trail that went from Chicago, and we know that freedom seekers were moving in that direction, following that pattern on their way to Detroit and then freedom in Canada. Now, down along the Sauk Trail corridor, at the very southern edge of Cook County and eastern Will County, is the community of Crete. And the Crete Congregational Church and Cemetery were organized in the 1850s. And that church still stands. It's now being turned into a museum. And I worked closely with these people to get this onto what's called the National Park Service National Registry of Underground Railroad Sites, called the Network to Freedom. And they've been doing some very, very interesting things. And I'm going to circle back to both the Ton Farm and this church in a minute or two. Both of these are designated sites on the National Network to Freedom, established by the National Park Service. There are around 28 other sites that have been identified. My research suggests that there are probably close to 90 places in Illinois where we can identify as significant places of interaction with freedom seekers. And of these, 28 have been identified. In Chicago, the Ton Farm, what we did was the only recognized site for years. A couple of years ago, colleagues got Graceland Cemetery on the National Register of Underground Railroad Sites because it is the final resting place for a number of the white and black abolitionists that were assisting freedom seekers. So part of what we've discovered in our work is we've gotten very, very clear that there are corridors from Chicago heading through the Calumet region. And again, up here, every red arrow represents a site. Up here, people coming out of Chicago, following that historic Chicago road, other groups of folks coming along this pattern, and there were variations in the road, there were changes because of weather, but you can see there were those two kind of fundamental patterns. So we started saying, okay, how do we connect the dots? And we began to realize that if we are telling freedom seeker stories, if those are journey stories, then we have got to be able to figure out, well, now, where did freedom seekers go when they left Chicago? And so I started looking at the historic patterns of travel. And of course, that's the corridor of the Great Sauk Trail going from the Mississippi coming over. And then we have above it the historic roads that make up the Great Chicago-Detroit Road, which follows the Sauk Trail pretty much. And then in Michigan was the development of what Michigan people call their territorial road. And then there were other roads that connect. And so we began to realize that the patterns of movement flowed from Chicago around the bottom of the lake. They flowed across Northeastern Illinois, joined together and headed for Detroit. So we said, if we want to develop a historic trail that would allow us to commemorate those journeys and also connect the dots on these Underground Railroad sites, what could we come up with? And so we have designed the beginnings of what we're calling the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail. And it follows those old roads as much as possible. And of course, there'd be a branch going down to Sauk Trail. Time?
10-2.
Good. Okay, so what we are advocating is that the way to tell the freedom seeker stories and the Underground Railroad site stories is by developing a trail that commemorates those journeys. And then all along the way, being able to tell the stories. And so that's where the trail needs to go. In addition, we need to figure out how to talk about freedom seekers that followed the Sauk Trail corridor into Detroit. And we are in the midst of a fascinating conversation with people in northern Indiana who are trying to figure out how do they talk about freedom seeker stories in the rest of northern Indiana. So we're up to a kind of a whole new project. And I think it has really exciting consequences because it enables us to connect the dots and enables us to tell the freedom seeker stories. Okay, the main route starts in Bronzeville, coming around there, and it starts down here in Crete. And there in looking at the city of Chicago, that was the historic Vincennes Trace that came out of Chicago. And down below is where the old Chicago Road branched off of that and headed south. So we're looking at developing a freedom trail that would pretty much parallel those old trails. And turning it sideways, we start up here in the middle of Bronzeville with the location of Clint Chapel and then the Zora Olivet Baptist Church, and then following down King Drive, hooking up into Michigan Drive, and connecting together Underground Railroad sites, other great institutions and parks and other things as a way of telling freedom stories in Chicago. And looking at this lower level, first thing I want to point out quickly with this is notice in the box, Michigan Avenue wiggles, right? You may not know this, but in Roseland, Michigan Avenue wiggles. And in Chicago, if a road wiggles, it's over. Because when they created Chicago, they created this grid map. Everything's, east, west, north, south, except things that were already there. And we know, for example, as they developed this, because that old section of Michigan Avenue going right through Roseland was part of that historic road from Chicago to Detroit. So here again, we've got the Vincennes Trail, and then we've got the historic road right up there on Michigan City. So in Roseland is a living piece of a historic highway that was followed by thousands of pioneers and thousands of entrepreneurs and hundreds of freedom seekers on their way to freedom. Okay, now we're suggesting that we put the Freedom Trail coming right up that road. Some of you know the south suburbs. Do you know Michigan City Road? Do you know why it's called Michigan City Road? Because it was the road to Michigan City. That's the road to Detroit and freedom and Canada. And that's this stretch of highway right. That's the Michigan City Road. Okay, so we've been trying to put a lot of pieces together and identify, again, Underground Railroad related sites along the trail. And then down along the Sauk Trail, of course, you got the Sauk Trail. There were other old post roads that existed in the area. And we're seeing the development of the Sauk Trail branch. It's coming down here to the middle of Crete to that historic church, and then going over and up through Sauk Trail. And again, each one of the red lines indicates a place where we know we have had Underground Railroad activity, and we need help to track all of that down. They're continuing. The routes for the Freedom Trail will come through Indiana, link up in Laporte, and go on over up and further into Michigan. Now, I want to tell you two stories now. Reflecting these kinds of journeys, share two stories. First is Carolyn Quarles. This is the only picture we have of Caroline. She's in her later years. Caroline grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. She was enslaved in her family's household. She was the child of her master's son, and who Robert Quarles Sr., a man had grown up in Virginia and knew the Jeffersons. They moved to St. Louis. His son, Robert Quarles Jr., was getting married at the age of 28 and decided, among other things, he'd have his way with some of the slave women. And one of them was a young slave woman named Maria, 17 years old. And the result was Caroline. So at age 16, here's Caroline, this beautiful young woman, long black hair, pale skin, freckles, blue eyes, and she was enslaved, grew up in the household with her cousins, who were all free. And at age 16, Caroline decided she'd had enough and she was going to become a free person. Also, I believe that Caroline well understood that a beautiful young woman of 16
could be easily kidnapped, beautiful and enslaved woman of 16, could be easily kidnapped and taken to New Orleans, and she would spend her life in a fancy house. So she decided to go for her freedom. And Caroline had this remarkable journey. She traveled, she went down to the docks in St. Louis, passed as a white person, bought a ticket on a riverboat, took the riverboat to Galena. She gets off the riverboat in Galena, and there's one black guy living in Galena, and he comes up and says, "You're passing. We know about you. The slave catchers are after you already." The riverboat company were the ones liable for Caroline's return because they had sold her. Anyways, this black guy helps her. They get her on the first stage out of Dodge, and going from Galena, the first stage goes to Milwaukee. So she ends up in Milwaukee, and the people in Milwaukee had never seen a fugitive slave, and they were just kind of amazed. These good white abolitionists. They took 3 weeks to figure out, well, how do we support Caroline? And they decided one of their number would be her escorts. And they traveled around the city of Chicago because of the slave hunters, and went across over into Detroit and Freedom in Canada. And they traveled right through areas that we know. They came down through Dundee and Elgin, Naperville, Lockport, Homer Township. They stayed a couple nights in Crete. Remember the people in Crete that started that church? They're the people that responded to Caroline when she came through. She then went over and spent some time in Westville, and then Cassopolis and on to Michigan. And one of the delights of our traveling life for Lil and I, my wife and I, has been, we have gotten to know some of Caroline's descendants in Canada, and just terrific people. In Canada today, there are 7 predominantly African Canadian communities, and those are all the descendants of freedom seekers that came out of the South and made their way to Canada. And the final story is, and I want to tell this story because of your maritime connections and because of your location. I mean, this is the South Branch, right? Right here?
The South Fork of the South.
The South Fork of the South. Okay.
Also called
Bubbly Creek, the South Fork of the South. Okay. Henry Stevenson was enslaved on a farm in central Missouri, and by all accounts was well regarded. On the neighboring farm, a young couple named Anthony and Martha, who were enslaved, decided the only way they were going to be free would be to escape, and so they escaped and took off. Their owner came to see Henry's owner, and said, "I have hired a slave catcher." You'll love this. Uriah Hinch. Isn't that a great name for a slave catcher? So he said, "I have hired Uriah Hinch, and I want you to come help me find Anthony and Martha and bring Henry along, because Henry's a really bright guy, and he can help us search for Anthony and Martha." Well, Henry was a divided opinion on whether to help or not, but because he was enslaved, he didn't have any choice. His owner said, "You're going." So they traveled across the Missouri, and that's Caroline's journey. So Henry and the crew traveled across Missouri and into Illinois, and then went up the Illinois River. And every major community that stopped at, they had flyers and they had posters and things, descriptions of Anthony and Martha. And whenever they stopped in a community, the white guys would go to the sheriff and other people and distribute the flyers. "We're looking for Anthony and Martha," and they sent Henry to talk to the people of color. And so they were in a town on the Mississippi River, and Henry comes back and says, "That's right, maybe Martha, Anthony, they're here, but I think they're going to Chicago." They get across Illinois, they're in Peoria, and the white guys go and they talk to all the officials, and Henry goes and talks to black people that live in Peoria. He comes back and says, "My God, it's true. Anthony and Martha are going to Chicago. We can find them." And they're delighted because Henry gets this fresh information. They go up the Illinois River, and they get to Ottawa, and they get on the Iron Canal. And they're on a canal. This is 1850. They're on a canal. And they stop in Ottawa, and of course, the white guys go and talk to white people, and Henry talks to the black laborers and so on, said, come back. Henry says, my gosh, they are headed for Chicago. They've been here. And wow, isn't it terrific? We got Henry here. And Furmons. They get up on the, they're taking the canal boat up, coming up here to Chicago, and Henry is fascinated by the locks and how all that mechanical stuff works. And so they come to the lock, and he'd go up on deck, and he kind of watched the tenders and all that. And one time there was a group of Irishmen working on the canal, and they saw Henry standing, and they says, "Hey, you're in Northern Illinois. You can be free. Run away." And Henry said, "I told them I'm working for a master. Can't do it." So they get to Chicago. They come up here to the end of the canal, and from the end, it's about a mile or so into the little town center. So Henry says, well, I'll go talk to the black people, and they'll go talk to the white people. So he gets off the canal boat, he walks across, and there's a black guy on top of a freight wagon, and he says, you want to ride into the town? And Henry says, yeah. He gets up in the wagon, and the black guy turns and says, are you a slave? And Henry says, well, yeah. And the guy goes, do you want to be free? And Henry says, well, of course I want to be free. So the wagon driver takes them to this group of black abolitionists. And he gets to them, they talk to him and say, Henry, we can help you get to freedom. Let's check out something. They checked out a few things. And I said, the way it looks clear, but we're a little short on money. Henry says, I can get money. And so he gets back on another wagon. He goes back to the canal, gets on the canal boat, and he tells his master, you know what? Anthony and Martha are here. We can get them, but I need some cash. I just need some cash. And so, of course, they're thrilled. Good, faithful, dutiful Henry. We got him now. So they give him a bunch of money. And Henry says, thanks very much, I'll be right back. And he gets out of another wagon, he goes downtown, he gets to the abolitionists. And technically what the black abolitionists did was they bought a ticket on the lake steamer that went along the bottom of Lake Michigan, stopped in the dunes, stopped in Michigan City, stopped in New Buffalo. And by 1850, the Michigan Central had been built to New Buffalo. And so they got him a ticket on the lake steamer, they got him a ticket on the train, and he got to Detroit and then freedom in Canada. Now we've got loads of stories like that. And I think part of what we're all trying to do is reframe the conversation, see the value of both the stories of freedom seekers and the stories of those that responded to them, and to find ways to knit that together. And what some of us are doing now at the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project is we're trying to connect those dots so that we really can be doing all that we can to tell these great stories and to link all the pieces together to see this kind of remarkable part of American history that has been so, we just haven't seen the whole picture. And now I think we can. And so anyways, I'd love to see if there are any questions, but I'd like Tom to take just 3 or 4 minutes and tell you a little bit about the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project, since Tom is here. And I think we need to stand here so they can.
Boy, I do. Round of applause for this.
There.
Well, thank you for having us here tonight. And I joined up with Larry, about 20 years ago when a group in Pullman where I live, and at that time, Susan and David, you were still living in Pullman at that time, a group of historians from the neighborhood realized that there was this story just a couple miles south of where our homes were in Pullman that hardly anybody knew about. Nobody thought that, as Larry pointed out, thought that the Underground Railroad was related to the south side of Chicago or to Pullman, the Pullman area out there. And we began to study it, and we had meetings at the Hotel Florence back then and the YMCA on 111th Street in Roseland, and began to study this. And ultimately, we formed a group that around 2017, we formed a group and became incorporated a couple years later and formed the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project. We have some brochures here that you're welcome to take one along with you. And then we had some great accomplishments that Larry pointed out, such as getting the marker out there and incorporation and getting on the Network to Freedom in 2019. And so we've had some great success. And what we're doing is we have a contract with the Cook County Forest Preserves to do 4 tours each year through the forest preserves and out to bringing people to where the Ton Farm once was. We do presentations. Larry's done numerous presentations for historical societies, school groups, church groups, and whatnot. Last time we were here, when we get to the Q&A, I have some questions for Larry too, because last time we were here, Larry, if you remember, it was on St. Patrick's Day.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And it was about 5, 6, 7 years ago on St. Patrick's Day. And we came down here and I said, Larry, I think that's kind of an Irish neighborhood down there. Of course, a lot of Irish that worked on the I&M Canal ultimately came and settled in this area around here. So I'm going to ask Larry to expound on that a little bit when he talks. But what we want to do, we're broadening. We have a great group, a working group, and we have a partnership with the Calumet Heritage Partnership. David Klein is a board member as well as I am, and he's our fiscal agent. We are now taking, we finally got a bank account after all those years, and we're taking some donations and memberships. So it's a meager $35 to become a member and to help us along with our journey. We'll be out in South Bend next week, and we do this all. We're volunteers. Nobody gets paid for what we do, but we are, like Larry said, connecting the dots and visiting all these different historical societies, the National Park Service at the dunes, the Indiana Preservation locations along the way. And it's a labor of love. We're meeting wonderful people who have little bits and pieces that they just haven't really met up with folks like us that have a vision to bring that heritage trail from Brownsville and Chicago all the way out to Detroit, then across the Detroit River. So that's something Larry's been working on for many, many years, and we're working on it to accomplish ultimately that the National Park Service would recognize that as one of the, is it 2 in the country, 2 national heritage trails that related to the Underground Railroad. So take a brochure along. Our contact information is on the back, mine and Larry's, and you can join us at any of our meetings and make a donation if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And if I may, I need to add one shameless commercial. This just got published in September, Southern Illinois University Press, and this really is this is kind of the end product of my 20 years of research. And if I've got them here, if you want to buy one, $25 American. And I always feel a little awkward saying it, but I will tell you, there is an organization called the Underground Railroad Free Press, which is an online newsletter that has subscription base of 26,000 people around the country, all kinds of people related to the railroad. Well, last month, they awarded this book their 2023 Memorial Prize for the Advancement of Knowledge, the Underground Railroad. And I was stunned when they wrote in a citation and they said, this is the finest book yet written on the actual workings of the. And I just thought, wow, okay. So I guess take it from them If you want a book about the actual work example about railroad, think about it. But I've got two other books also. With one of Caroline's descendants, we wrote the story of Caroline Quarles. And then this book has a lot of the details about stuff in detailed stuff in Northwest Indiana, in South Cook County, and over into Livingston County. So got those three things, and my lovely assistant is here. Vanna White is here to hasn't turned white yet, but But anyways, we good. So are there any questions? Anything that you wanted to do?
But sort of statistically, how many people were caught? Who were starting this trip?
That's a really good question. First of all, just to frame it, we think that roughly 40 to 50,000 people made their way through the northern states of Canada. If you count up all of the people that escaped successfully, that escaped, it probably gets close to 80 to 100,000 people over the decade, in the decades before. Tragically, we know that a large number of people did not make it, and we have continued to search for ways to quantify that, and we just haven't. But I think my sense of it in Illinois, for example, if 6 to 8,000, 6 to 10,000 somehow or another come into Illinois, we know that 3 to 4,000 come to Chicago, another couple thousand settle. It's really likely that of those that made it into Illinois, there could have easily been a couple thousand that were captured and sent back. And it was just that's an awful statistic. Remember that there were people enslaved who found their freedom and stayed in place. They lived in the woods, they lived on the edge of farms or whatever, and they maintained connection with the community. And we don't know that number either, but probably thousands of people that found their freedom but didn't leave the South. Then there are these 40 to 50,000 that came into the northern states. But the numbers of those that, and we have a lot of stories, and the stories are just awful. Yeah.
You're familiar with the slave house in
Am I familiar with the slave house in Southern Illinois? Yes, that's a very interesting story. It is the historical reality is very complex. I think some of the claims may not be as complete as they're made. However, the fundamental story, the slave house, was a part of what was referred to as reverse undeveloped. It was a place where people who were kidnapping freedom seekers in Southern Illinois, one of the places they took them was to the slave house in Equality, Illinois. Interesting. And then they were sold back into slavery. And the heart of the story, I believe, is I've read all those stuff. The heart of it is, yes, true, but I think there are ways in which that story's been elaborated that might not hold up the story. But it's a very interesting phenomenon. There were regular organized kidnapping gangs. I have a part of a chapter in the book deals with kidnappers, the kidnapping gangs, a couple really horrendous gangs, and they would go on to, they lay in wait along trails and roads, and they'd rip people out of stagecoaches, they'd rip people off the trains, and whether they were runaway slaves or not, if they were black, they they took because of where we're sitting, Bridgeport, I have to tell you. This one kidnapping gang, kidnapped about 1858. Kidnapped this guy, and he was on a train. They got on the train, they grabbed him off the train and took him to jail. And the sheriff said, "What? Why is this? Well, he's black." And the guy was kind of dark complected. He had a bushy mustache and a distinctive Irish brogue. And the guy kept saying, I'm an Irishman, I live in Chicago. And they said, no, he's black. And so the sheriff wasn't sure what to do because he kind of looked like a black guy, but he did have a robe. He said he was Chicago. It was Thomas Leary. So anyway, they didn't know what to do, except some people sent a message on the Illinois Central. This was in Jonesboro, which is Central Illinois, a message. And so the Tribune came out, front page headlines, Chicago and held enslaved in the jail. And the sheriff didn't know what to do with this supposedly black Irish. And so, so he called the state senator from that part of Southern Illinois to come interview Mr. Leary. And so the state senator came and he had a nice conversation with the guy in jail. And he said to the sheriff, well, he is an Irishman, but that's pretty much like being a black person. So send him to stay. Anyway, fortunately, because the Tribune reporters had found out about this, they were able to get the guy free. He got back to Chicago. Can you imagine? I mean, that's pretty. It's a funny story, but that's just incredibly serious. Another question or two? Yeah.
Okay, how are you going about getting people in Roseland and Brownsville involved?
We have been delighted by our response. We have had several organizing meetings in Brownsville, and it has included people across Brownsville and Roseland. We have had some academics, community leaders, tourism officials, and the heads of various kinds of groups. And so we're working very closely with the Brownsville Historical Society people, and so we've got a really great network emerging of people. We've done a similar thing in the south suburbs, and again we've got academics and tourism people and community leaders and people that are interested in Black history and kind of an interesting assortment of people. And it appears our experience seems to be that it's like we've got an idea that's making sense to a lot of people, that we've really got to raise up these stories. We've got to really commemorate these stories, and then wouldn't it be remarkable if we could develop an actual historic trail with markers and guidebooks, and there would be a parallel online version, so you could have a QR code and you come up to Quinn Chapel and hit the QR code and you get stories of freedom. All that kind of stuff, and people are real excited about those ideas. So we've been delighted. We have a similar group of interested folks in Northwest Indiana, and Wednesday we're going to be meeting with a bunch of people in South Bend, including faculty at Notre Dame, the universities, ISU, and so on. Thank you very much. It's always a delight to meet you guys, and if you are interested, please come look us up, the Little Calumet River Project on Facebook, and in the spring, join us on one of our groups.
Thank you very much. Great. And come up and buy some books. I think we bought some.
Thank you everyone for joining. We'll be posting this downloaded online, and we'll send an email out what you want to do. Thanks everyone for coming.
Set it down.
And that's unencumber you.
Yeah, right. This stuff is